Welcome back to another video. We're going to get right into it with this one. I promised this one a while ago, and of course, now that we're back, this is going to be the first one. I want to go over a little bit about how I do DNS resolution, some of the tools I use, some of the techniques. I did some Excalidraw, whatever it's called here, to try and explain what's kind of going on. We're going to keep it pretty high level, just because I think that's plenty to make it make sense. We're not going to go super in depth. If you want more in-depth stuff, hit me up on either Twitter, Discord, or whatever. But I just kind of want to get high level, my thoughts, my techniques, and kind of like what I do. It's nothing special. A lot of other people do it. It's nothing like arcane or hidden. It's just kind of like some DNS tricks and tips, I guess. So we're going to get into it. I've done other talks and have talked about this in the past, but I rely a lot on passive DNS sources, and then I resolve those sources. And then I also do a lot of re-resolving. So something that may have either not resolved the day before, but now resolves today, or something that did resolve yesterday, but doesn't resolve anymore, or resolves to something new, or whatever that may be. So I try to use passive DNS sources to get new assets and information, as well as keeping the information I already have in my database up to date, right? With my automation. So this first picture that you're looking at right now is kind of what I would do for a passive sort of flow, right? We'll talk about alteration scanning and brute forcing because it looks a little bit different, but I tried to kind of Excalidraw it here. So I'll try and explain some of these little arrows again. It's really basic. If you know anything about DNS, this will all make a lot of sense, right? So when you're doing recursive DNS resolution, you start at a root DNS server, which is just like a dot, and then you go to the top level domain name, and then you go subdomain by subdomain, and you hit all these authoritative name servers as you go up until you get the one that's actually in charge of whatever domain you're looking for up here. So if we're looking for subdomain.supersecret.com, sooner or later, for example, let's just say we landed a name server that handles, all the subdomains, like the whole zone under star.supersecret.com. But to get these name servers, normally you have to go to, the TLD name servers and that'll tell you how to get here, and you can go all the way back to the root. What does that recursive lookup is a recursive DNS resolver. You have one on your browser. You normally have, that's what does it, if you don't set one, all that kind of stuff. There's also public ones, right? So 8.8.8.8 is Google's. Quad 1s is Cloudflare's. There's a ton of different ones, but you can also host these on your own. So I used to use PowerDNS. Recursor was one that I used. Now I use one called Not Resolver. Interesting fact, Not Resolver was actually what Cloudflare used to use to support 1.1.1.1 before they built their own internally. They actually just used Not Resolver, to a much higher level than I am right now, but they used to use Not Resolver under the hood until they built their own. Interesting. So that's what I use right now. We're going to go over towards the end here. We're going to go over Not Resolver and PowerDNS and kind of like my thoughts on those. But what I'm doing is I have my automation running here that may be pulling certificate data using Gungnir or other stuff, maybe doing passive DNS data, or it may be pulling old, what I would call like expired or out of date data from my database and like trying to re-resolve it, right? Either way, it's going to go to, this is all running on my VPS. So let's say this automation is running in a Docker container. I will have my recursor, right now it's Not Resolver, but it could be PowerDNS or anything else. It will be running on my VPS on the same machine, like on 127.0.0.1 on port 53. So there's no cross network call. If you use 8.8.8.8 or Cloudflare or whatever, to do your recursive DNS, just as an example, not only do you run into issues with rate limiting and some other stuff like that and multicast issues and whatever, you also are sacrificing the latency of making that extra call and getting it back. It's fast, but when you're doing it at scale, like that will actually matter. This you can configure on your own. You can cache it on your own. You can see it comes with its own little cache. So if I'm looking for a bunch of subdomains for supersecret.com, the first time it does something, it will have to start at the root, but then it will cache this root. Normally they just come pre-cached, but it will cache each step of the way. So if I need to find another subdomain of supersecret.com, the second time this local not resolver does a resolution of any subdomain of supersecret.com, it will just start with this one automatically, right? Because it's cached locally. So when you're doing like repetitive resolutions of like similar subdomains, it also helps there too. But This does all the recursive resolution, but it saves some of the jumps of going out and back to 8.8.8 or whatever and Cloudflare. It's right here locally. So when my automation makes a DNS request, instead of saying, hey, I'm using this IP address at port 53 for my resolver, it's actually just localhost at 53 for my resolver. So I like to use ZDNS, but I use pure DNS. We'll talk about that later. Pure DNS, ZDNS. I tend to avoid DNSX personally. I use ZDNS as a library, which is one of the reasons why I use it in automation, is just because it's available as a library that I can use in Go code. But we'll talk about pure DNS later because I really like pure DNS as well. But this is for passive stuff. So all of my subdomains are coming into here. They're all being resolved locally by this local not resolver. And that's how I do it. Now, if you're doing bigger and bigger automation, the first question that comes up is going to be scaling, right? Because you're going to want to scale your automation, this little square right here, right? Maybe you want more resolver workers, maybe you want more threads, maybe you want more whatever. But how do you scale this, right? So there's a couple of ways to do that. The way that I do it, which in my opinion is kind of the simplest way, is something that actually looks like this. So, this is just them calling out to something different, but it's pretty obvious here. What actually happens is if you're spinning up multiple VPSs with multiple instances of your automation, whether it's deployed in a container, or these could be Kubernetes, like Kubernetes too, these could be on pods, or, obviously these might be different pods. They could be in the same pod. It's really up to you. But these could be separate VPSs. These could be separate nodes on Kubernetes. But each instance of a node is what I would call it. So an actual server, not every container, but every server that you deploy, or that I deploy in this theoretical example, would have its own resolver on that node. So everything that's running on that node can always use the localhost resolver there to do its resolution. And then it scales this way. You don't need any more than one on each one, but each one has its own, right? Now, there's other ways to do this if you want to. For instance, if you want these to be on their own, one caveat here is each of these not resolvers that you're seeing here have separate caches. As you can tell, there's 3 separate caches, which technically speaking could degrade performance. So something else you could do if you want to get super complicated and you really are doing that much resolving is you can take these not resolvers and host them in their own pods and use something like a load balancer, which we will talk about later, to actually have the caching all in one place, but then load balance DNS queries to multiple instances of recursive resolvers like not resolver. We'll talk about some of that later. I don't think that's necessary personally. I think it works a little bit better. Yes, it's 3 separate instances of caching and whatever, but I think this works better and it makes it just a little bit more easy to scale, like in my head. Because instead of worrying about how my DNS infrastructure is scaling separate to how like my automation application as a whole is scaling, I know every time I wrote it as automation here, but let's just say this is actually the DNS worker. Like it's a worker that just does DNS resolution. I know every time I make a new instance of that, so a new instance of 100 threads, that it also comes with its new resolver locally right there. That's just for that DNS worker. So I know I'm scaling at a certain rate, right? So let's say we know whatever server we're resolving on, that this not resolver really starts to degrade after so many requests per second. Well, now I know that each instance of my DNS worker should not go over that rate limit, but that at that point, if I need more requests, I just have to scale out, right? And I can really flatten my amount of requests, and I know exactly when I need to scale, and everything kind of scales at once, where if these not resolvers were behind a load balancer on their own, you would also be responsible for scaling that appropriately along with the automation, and it's kind of separate. Now, in a super enterprise production environment, like maybe that is really the right way to do it. I don't really know, but this works best for me because it kind of all scales on its own together. Now, something else why I really like this is this isn't totally DNS related, but the reason why I call this automation and not just a like resolver worker is, like I said, this has everything cached for you, what you just hit, at least for a little while, for whatever the time to live is set to. So what a lot of people do in automation, right, is they resolve something, and then everything that resolves, you want to try and look for web servers. That's what a lot of bug bounty hunters do with the automation, right? So if I resolved something and then right after I resolve something, I'm going to try and web fingerprint it, well, your local resolver has the DNS information cached. So when I go to send that HTTP request, if I in the HTTP client say, hey, use this resolver, when I make an HTTP request, because normally the first step of an HTTP request is going to be, where am I sending this request? But cached here locally is where to send that HTTP request. So it's actually going to make your HTTP request, any fingerprinting, scanning, whatever down the road, a little bit faster because it's cached right here. So that's kind of why I like it personally this way. But again, you can take your resolvers and scale them separately. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But this is how I scale my stuff. Makes it very simple, makes it very easy. Is it quote unquote production ready? Maybe not, but this is how I do it. Again, if there's any questions about this, let me know. So this is a little bit different. So if I'm going to brute force something, or I'm really, like, let's say you're really focused on one target and you really just want to find as many assets as you possibly can, every last single one, every little nook and cranny of DNS that you can find, you want to find it. Let's say you're doing the Recon Royale competitions, or you are doing bug bounty hunting, but you're doing it on one specific target and you really just want every domain or something, right? At some point, yes, you may want to try and brute force, or you may want to do like alteration scanning, or do like, you know, maybe you found dev 1, 2, 3 and now you want to find 4, 5, 6 or whatever. The way I've always done it in the past is then you would have your VPS over here. I didn't put my automation in here because, again, I don't currently do this in my like day-to-day automation that I have running currently, just because it generates a lot of traffic. And I have really good results with passive DNS and certificate data alone, but that's just my opinion. But you could be running a VPS here that's, again, my tool of choice would be pure DNS as far as like doing brute forcing. But you could have a VPS running pure DNS. I also personally would use Trickus lists of resolvers. Again, a lot of this stuff will all be in the description below, all the like links to tools and stuff like that. But I would use pure DNS on a VPS. I would go to Trickus resolvers, and it's the same process over here, right? But the first couple times you do this, if you're looking for just subdomains of supersecret.com, you already know that. You already know you're giving this, you know, pure DNS a word list. You're going to use all of these resolvers, not just one, but you're going to use this long list of resolvers. And the other ticket is, again, when you go up this chain, who's really going to give you the answer of whether this subdomain exists or not is going to be this name server right here. So a little trick is, especially with brute forcing, is to do your brute forcing directly to this name server. Find this name server, or write up a little bit of code that runs before pure DNS. Find this name server that's the authoritative name server for the actual zone you're trying to brute force, and then send the brute force traffic directly to that. Yes, technically each of these resolvers will have its own cache and might cache all the way up to this authoritative server up here, but the fact that you're using so many at one time and you're trying to spread your traffic out means that all of these resolvers might have to do this chain at least once, and then depending on time to live or how their cache works, like it may come uncached or whatever. So if you just write a little script or do a little bit of logic to find this server right away, and then using pure DNS send all of your brute forcing traffic directly to the authoritative server, it will go a lot faster. Now, the reason why at this point I'm using a big list of resolvers for brute forcing versus just like my one not resolver from some of the other pictures is a lot of authoritative servers will not like you if you send a lot of traffic that results in NX domain. Like if you have a 99.9% fail rate because you're brute forcing, a lot of authoritative servers will just start either blocking you or dropping your packets or whatever, right? And that is actually happening more and more and more, especially as just like internet traffic blows up. I've ran into it. I've talked to some people who have run into it, even like more than I have. So if you're doing really, really heavy brute forcing, you can't do it from one IP address. You just can't do it. You can do a chunk of it, but if you're going to do like a lot, you have to spread it out. And Trickus resolvers is the list that I've heard that a lot of people use, that I've used before as well. And that pretty much would be my flows. Use pure DNS on a VPS, use Trickus resolvers, and put a little bit of logic, either just like a bash script or something like that. You can like just script around dig or something, and basically find this name server that you're looking for, and then brute force that one directly with pure DNS. That's kind of the flow for brute forcing. Again, I do not do that day to day, hour to hour. My continuous recon is continuous recon of CT logs, of passive subdomain data, and some other things that we will talk about in later videos maybe. And hitting that data and then keeping it up to date, as well as, you know, finding new stuff from that kind of flow. And I found that I find enough stuff consistently that I don't really result to this that much, just because, again, it's just so much overhead and a lot. So I don't do it a whole bunch. Now, we've now gone over passive, scaling, and brute forcing. Again, if you wanted to brute force more, you could spin up more VPSs and that kind of stuff too. But that's up to you. Now, tooling, the last part. Okay, I already mentioned I use Not Resolver. There's a documentation page for it. It's super, super simple to install. I'm literally going to show you the config file that I used, and I'm pretty sure still use, to just deploy a local instance of it and have it running on like each of the VPSs. Okay, and it looks like that. That's all it is. And I'm 99% sure this is like cut and dry out of the docs. It's pretty straightforward to know what's happening right now. You have the cache size set down here. You have some modules loaded, so you load custom root hints. You could probably take away stats and stuff like that. This is, I'm pretty sure, just like cookie cutter out of the docs, right? But I have it listening on only localhost, right? So pretty much what I'm doing here is I'm looking for this one right here on localhost. And that means like I'm not like hitting it over the network or anything like that. It's going to be deployed on the box that my automation is deployed on, and it's going to be hitting it on localhost right there. So there's no over-the-wire network calls, right? Again, this is like super simple. This isn't some like secret thing. I'm pretty sure this is literally out of the docs. It says refer to manual, right? So let me see here. Okay. So we're here on the Not Resolver page. You're going to go here. It's going to show you how to download it. If you go here, download, literally you can use that. You can even just use like package managers and stuff to install it. It's super basic to install. There's documentation here on it. It's going to go over like super basic how to run it, how to tune it, how to get the most performance out of it, that kind of stuff. Play with it, enjoy it. Again, it all depends. If you're running it on some bare metal server, tune it up, get the performance right. It's super basic. If you understand DNS, getting performance out of a resolver to like a certain point before you tip over into like really crazy stuff like PCAP or XDP or anything like that, like you can get quite a bit with not that much complication. Okay. Now, again, I mentioned I used to use Power DNS. It's super good tool. I just swapped to Not Resolver because it was a little bit easier to deploy and use personally. But Power DNS has two tools that are super cool. So they have their comparison here, and put this over here, to Not Resolver called the Power DNS Recursor. It is basically the same thing as Not Resolver. It is a recursive DNS resolver. That's what it does, right? So same thing as Not Resolver. This would be the comparable thing. Now, they also have a tool called DNS Dist, which is exactly what it sounds like and exactly what it says right here. Let's accept our cookies. Great. Superior performance of DNS load balancing with Power DNS Dist, right? So it looks exactly like what you see in their little sweet graphic here, right? Is all the traffic actually comes into DNS Dist. There's these in the back, and it load balances them based on whatever strategy you want, right? Now, I used DNS Dist with Power DNS Recursor behind it for a while. Like I said, it just got complicated, and I got more out of just putting a Not Resolver locally on each one. I got just as much performance. I actually got a little bit better. But there was a while where I had Power DNS running on its own machine, and then I had like much smaller instances of Recursor. I had like 4 or 5 of them running behind it, right? If you're going to run huge scale, you can scale infinitely, basically, with something like DNS Dist, and you don't have to put Power DNS Recursor behind it. If you use Not Resolver and you really like it, I'm 99% sure, because I've seen other people do it, that you can use DNS Dist to load balance to Not Resolver. Because all you're doing on DNS Dist is saying, okay, go to, like, here's the IP addresses of all the resolvers I have downstream of me, and manage that, right? And then you like give it a load balancing policy and whatever. So you can kind of mix and match. But DNS Dist works really good out of the box. Again, it's like 10 lines of configuration, and you have a DNS load balancer. And at that point, again, you can, so Power DNS has a product that I think they call Cloud Control, which is basically all of their products Kubernetes in the cloud and whatever, but you have to pay a bunch of money for it. But they do give Docker containers of all this stuff that you can mix and match and you can deploy on your own and whatever. If you're going to deploy stuff like this in Kubernetes or even in Docker, you kind of have to build it yourself if you don't want to pay for it. But all these tools are available openly to use for free. So yeah, again, I use NotResolver right now. I like it a lot. It was really easy to deploy and all that kind of stuff. But the two Power DNS tools here, again, you don't need their authoritative server. That's the opposite of what we're trying to do. But you could try Power DNS or Cursor if you want. And again, if you want load balancing, I would just use DNS dist. It worked super great for me. But again, just for scaling purposes and keeping everything like straightforward, now if I ever like deploy a new node, it just comes with NotResolver. Just boom. You can make it an image, like an AMI in Amazon, or I think they just call it a snapshot or an image in DigitalOcean. And then whenever you like make a new node, if you're doing Kubernetes or if you're doing just like Dockerized stuff, whenever you deploy a new server, it's boom, it's just there. That's the way I like doing it. So you don't really need the load balancer, but if you want to go the load balancer route, it's right there. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, let me know. I hope I made everything really clear. Again, the benefit of a lot of the stuff and having your own little local resolver, you don't need anything crazy, but it does help you control your own performance. You get to track your own metrics, so you know if your requests are failing because you're sending them too fast, you know. With Google, you're just kind of guessing, right? Like, did it fail because of you or because of them, or do you even know it failed, or whatever? When you deploy your own thing, again, I have the stats thing coming out of NotResolver, so technically speaking, you can plug it right into Grafana and see how many queries each one is producing, fails, no errors, refused, anything like that, and why it failed and all that kind of stuff. It makes it super easy. The more stuff you deploy and that you manage, some people would argue it makes it harder, but if you really understand what you're using and put a little time into it, it actually makes everything better because you just get more visibility. The more things you pull in, the more visibility you get, which in my opinion can actually help make it a little easier. But that's just me. So if you have any questions, let me know on any of the platforms. But I hope this helped a little bit, explain how I do some resolving and tools that I use and stuff like that. I will see you on Twitch. I will see you back here on YouTube with the next one, Discord, etc. For now, hack the planet. I'll see you in the next one.